Hello, everyone. Today, I have to share the story of what I thought was the biggest betrayal of my life. The day I arrived at the boardroom with a coffee lukewarm in my hand and a smile that had learned to keep its teeth hidden. The glass doors parted, and I walked past portraits of men who liked the sound of their own names. Today's agenda was thin. Quarterly metrics, a proposed acquisition, and a list of personnel changes. I'd been working in operations for 9 years. I knew the rhythm of this company by heart. Still, my palms found the lining of my blazer as if they needed an anchor. The CEO, my husband's father, was already at the head of the table, a man whose handshake felt like an audit. He glanced at me with the kind of assessment reserved for a ledger. Numbers, margins, expendables. The meeting began with the usual perfunctory applause for the quarter and then moved on to a slide deck that felt hostile in its brightness. When the time came for staffing updates, his voice cut through the air like a lawyer's brief. We need results. Certain roles aren't pulling their weight. The sentence landed on me like a verdict. He looked me in the eye, slow and deliberate, and said, "You're relieved of your duties. Poor results." There was a silence that tasted like snowfall. Soft, but absolute. My husband slid a narrow piece of paper across to me, a list of shelters written as if the future he imagined for me had already been penciled in. He whispered, "You're on your own now." I folded that list into the seam of my palm and let the boardroom continue to hum around my silence. I stood, said understood, and walked out of the room the way people exit fires. Calm, with a coat on, but with everything burned behind them. Outside, in the stairwell, the city felt both obscene and sympathetic, skyscrapers gesturing their indifference. I didn't call anyone. I didn't cry. I rode the elevator down like a person leaving a rented life. That night, I slept at a small hotel under a different name, not because I had to hide, but because anonymity has a funny way of clarifying what you truly own. I spent the hours after the meeting assembling evidence, spreadsheets of efficiencies the board had missed, internal emails that mapped the real cost savings my team had engineered, a trail of decisions that proved I'd acted like an owner for years. My ownership had not been a secret in accounting or in the registrar's office. It was figurative until now. I had quietly built a portfolio of personal investments tied to the company's common stock and a holding entity registered offshore. Paperwork that had lain dormant and professional for years, like a rabbit inside a hat. I had warned no one because pride is a private thing until it becomes proof. At dawn, with the city still hungover from neon, I filed an amendment to the corporate registry and initiated a quietly structured proxy call. The legal counsel I retained was old school and clinical. She understood the architecture of surprise exactly as a musician understands silence. By the time the first email from the CEO arrived, demanding a sit-down, voice sharp and incredulous, I was sitting across from my lawyer, sipping tea and looking at the press release I would authorize at noon. I let the messages stack in my phone. 78 missed calls would later appear like ticks on a clock of their panic. When the world turned and the press release went live, concise, corporate, and impossible to misread, it said, effective immediately, an extraordinary shareholder vote had installed a new interim board and named a new acting CEO to stabilize operations. The language was sanitized, but the effect was seismic. The man who had fired me read his own name in disclosures, his ego made brittle by clauses. He called first, pleading like a man who thinks apology is a negotiable item. Next came my husband, whose voice cracked when he tried to explain himself. Then the father and son team both tried to bargain and bully their way back into a scenario that no longer existed. They had assumed that power lived in good suits and loud voices, but they had never grasped the quieter arithmetic of ownership. Stock options, transfer agents, irrevocable voting agreements. As calls poured in, the boardroom that once felt like a courtroom became a theater for their bewilderment. I listened to them plead, to the CEO repeat his line about poor results, to my husband say he'd been sorry, and I felt nothing like triumph and everything like the slow, cold wash of consequence. The satisfaction was not in seeing them humbled, it was in the exacting justice of structure. Rules, filings, the dry language of regulatory authority that doesn't care about feelings, only facts. I offered them an olive branch in private, a seat at a reconstituted advisory panel if they agreed to recuse themselves from day-to-day operations and to accept a public statement acknowledging past errors. They accepted, not because they trusted me, but because options had narrowed. Afterwards, the company stabilized under new governance. Investors appreciated predictability, employees appreciated that decisions would be evaluated on merit rather than lineage, and the markets, as they always do, reacted to confidence with capital. My husband moved out of the house we had shared. The legal dissolution of our personal and professional ties was thorough and embarrassingly tidy. Months later, I would stand in the same boardroom for the quarterly review and look at the same portraits of men. But now my signature would be on the front page financials. People who had mocked my soft skills now asked for my memo. I never took a victory lap. This was not about spectacle, but about stewardship. I instituted leadership workshops, open forums, and a transparency initiative that ensured personnel decisions would be recorded and justified. Sometimes, late at night after the last meeting, I would find the list of shelters my husband had slid across the table, folded in an old book, and I would think about how fragile assumptions are when stacked against recorded ownership and patient planning. To those who asked if I'd been cold to the men who had tried to cast me out, I would say only this. I allowed the company to become a place that could not be run on favors and fear alone. In the end, what they had once used as leverage, dismissal, humiliation, the adjacency of family, became an impossible currency in a business governed by documented authority. The last time the CEO called, his tone was steady and small. He wanted one meeting, a mediated conversation. I scheduled it not out of mercy, but because the business required it. I arrived on time, poured coffee for both of us, and when he looked up ripe with regret and a new humility, I offered what the company needed: governance, accountability, and a clear path forward. The meeting room was smaller this time. No long glass table, no panoramic city view, just 4 chairs and a pot of black coffee. The man who used to command boardrooms with a raised brow now seemed smaller than the chair he occupied. The air between us carried the stale scent of old pride. I watched as he tried to find his footing in a conversation that no longer revolved around his authority. His first words were cautious, almost trembling. He said, "You made your point. I underestimated you." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was surgical. I leaned back, the faint hum of the air conditioner filling the pause. I said finally, "You didn't underestimate me. You dismissed me. There's a difference." He nodded, swallowing that truth like bitter medicine. "I suppose there is." What followed wasn't a confrontation, it was an audit of accountability. I laid out the company's revised structure, the distribution of decision-making, the accountability matrix I had introduced. The changes weren't about revenge, they were about order. He listened, scribbling notes he didn't fully understand, the old reflex of control twitching beneath his calm facade. At one point he said, "You're colder than I remember." I smiled faintly. "No, I'm just finished needing to explain myself." The rest of the conversation unfolded like a quiet negotiation between history and consequence. When we finally stood to shake hands, his grip was hesitant, the firmness replaced by something almost apologetic. As he left the room, I could see the realization written across his posture. Authority had shifted, not by force, but by structure. And structure, unlike people, doesn't flinch. After the meeting, I stood by the window watching the traffic below stream like veins of light. The city didn't care who ruled which boardroom. That thought steadied me. My assistant entered, placing a file on my desk. Media inquiries, investor requests, and a handful of congratulatory letters. Among them was an envelope, handwritten, with my husband's name on it. I hadn't heard from him in weeks. The letter inside was short, 4 lines, shaky penmanship. I know I failed you. I see now what you carried alone. I'm not asking for forgiveness, only to tell you that I finally understand what power really is. It isn't control, it's endurance. I folded that note and placed it in my drawer beside the old shelter list, the 2 pieces of paper like bookends to a life that had imploded and rebuilt itself. Sometimes the hardest revenge isn't destruction. It's surviving so completely that your existence itself becomes evidence. Over the next months, I learned what quiet leadership truly meant. The board adjusted to my style, measured, documentation heavy, resistant to theatrics. I didn't demand loyalty, I cultivated competence. People worked differently when fear wasn't the currency. The office atmosphere changed, the murmur of cautious silence replaced by open collaboration. There were days when I caught myself in the glass reflections of the building and barely. Months blurred into quarters and quarters into fiscal years. Time, once measured by meetings and metrics, had become something quieter. I no longer woke up rehearsing conversations in my head or calculating defense strategies against invisible enemies. The company was steady now, profitable, respected, even admired. The boardroom no longer smelled of fear or ego, only coffee and deliberation. Yet with every layer of stability came a strange hollowness, a sense that the fire that had carried me here was burning out, leaving behind the scent of smoke and something faintly nostalgic. There were days when I'd pause in the middle of reviewing financials and realize I hadn't smiled. Not the polite curve of a professional grin, but a real, unguarded smile, in months. Success, I discovered, can be as lonely as failure. Both are isolating, just in different dialects. It was during one of those evenings when the office was empty and the city glowed like an endless grid of promises that I found myself revisiting the archives. I had the staff digitize old company records, and among the files, I came across a folder labeled Legacy Projects. Inside were photographs, charity galas, ribbon cuttings, employee picnics. Faces beamed at the camera, captured before ambition hardened into hierarchy. My husband was in several of them, his smile confident, arm draped over my shoulder. The images looked like artifacts from another life. For the first time in a long while, I felt something that wasn't anger or pride. It was grief, small and unassuming, like a forgotten note. I missed the version of myself who believed in partnership, who didn't keep everything under lock and claws. But I also knew she couldn't have survived this world. She had been necessary only for the beginning of the story. The woman who sat here now was something different, someone rebuilt from the bones of disbelief. I started to travel again. Not for mergers or acquisitions, but for breathing. Singapore, Vienna, Morocco, cities where no one recognized me, where I could walk through markets and train stations as a simple observer, not a name on a headline. In those places, anonymity became a luxury, not a punishment. I met people who didn't care what company I ran or who I had dethroned. They asked ordinary questions, what kind of coffee I liked, what music I listened to, what my favorite color was. It startled me how long it took to answer. Power teaches you to speak in precision. Strangers teach you to speak in truth. Somewhere between airports and hotel lobbies, I began to remember what softness felt like. Unstrategic, unrehearsed. One evening, in a small cafe in Lisbon, I found myself in conversation with a woman about leadership. She was a sculptor, her hands marked by clay, her life guided by shape rather than spreadsheets. People always think control is the opposite of chaos, she said, sipping her wine. But really, control is just another form of fear. That line stayed with me for weeks. When I returned home, I started delegating. Not because I was tired, but because I finally trusted. I built a leadership council of people I had mentored personally, giving them decision power. Watching them grow, argue, and lead reminded me of why I'd fought so hard in the first place. This was never meant to be a throne. It was supposed to be a foundation. The difference was everything. But life, in its quiet cruelty, doesn't grant peace without testing it. One morning, nearly 3 years after the boardroom coup, I received an email from my ex-husband. The subject line was simple. Can we talk? I hesitated before opening it. His words were restrained, careful, the way people write when they know they've forfeited the right to familiarity. He had fallen on hard times. His consultancy dissolved, debts piling up. He didn't ask for money. He asked for a meeting, just to clear the air. I sat with the message for days before replying. Come to the office next Thursday at 10 a.m. The decision wasn't emotional. It was procedural. Closure, like accounting, deserves precision. When Thursday arrived, he entered the office with a humility I'd never seen in him before. His hair had thinned, his posture softened. He carried no arrogance, just exhaustion. You look well, he said. His voice tentative. You look real, I replied, and the irony wasn't lost on either of us. We spoke for an hour, not of blame, but of consequence. He told me he had believed his father's version of power for too long, the version that equated dominance with worth. He thought dominance was legacy, he said quietly. Turns out, it's loneliness. I nodded. There was no satisfaction in his regret, only an understanding that we had both evolved into people who could no longer belong to each other. Before leaving, he said, You turned out to be the strongest person I ever knew. I smiled faintly. No, I said. I just stopped pretending weakness was kindness. He left without asking for anything, and for the first time, I didn't feel the need to forgive or forget. Some endings are clean because they're finally mutual. In the weeks that followed, I found a rhythm again, not of defense or ambition, but of balance. I began mentoring young women entering corporate spaces, teaching them the strategies I had learned the hard way. I didn't tell them to fight, I told them to build armor quietly. I didn't tell them to seek revenge, I told them to own their signatures, their shares, their names. The company grew, but so did something more valuable, its integrity. The boardroom that once witnessed my firing had become a sanctuary of competence, and every decision made within those glass walls now carried a trace of the woman who refused to stay small. Sometimes, I still visit that boardroom alone when the city outside is wrapped in fog. I sit at the head of the table, not as a ruler, but as a reminder. The chair doesn't belong to me. It belongs to whoever earns it next. Legacy, I've learned, isn't possession. It's influence that outlives you. I think of the girl who once left this same room in silence, clutching a list of shelters, and I whisper into the empty air, You were right to walk out quietly. Because sometimes the loudest victories are the ones that never needed an audience. They started calling it something other than a takeover in headlines, a recalibration. The phrase pleased me because it sounded less like spectacle and more like work. Work is what legacy is made of. Repetitive, stubborn, unromantic labor that compounds. I wanted both calm and grandeur, the quiet scaffolding of systems married to the sweep of real change. So I built with both hands. First came the Institute. Not a foundation with a marble plaque and predictable press photos, but a working institute embedded in the company. Leadership fellowships, a public governance curriculum, rotating residencies for mid-career managers. We converted an old division into a lab for policy experiments, pilots for parent leave models, standardized promotion criteria, and transparent error reports that read like case studies rather than cover-ups. I appointed former skeptics to lead it, because reform loses its potency if it only preaches to the choir. Watching them succeed felt like watching a city light up block by block. The reforms were modest in individual flash, but enormous in aggregate. Fewer capricious firings, clearer promotion paths, and a culture that rewarded endurance over theatrics. That was the quiet part. The dramatic part arrived not from PR, but from decisions that forced industry conversation. We took a public stand during a supply chain scandal that many companies treated as a distraction. I insisted on an independent audit and a full remedial plan, even knowing it would crater short-term margins. When analysts expected punishment for candor, a portion of the market rewarded us instead. Confidence returned, not because profits exploded, but because the rules were visible. Competitors watched, then copied. Regulators paid attention. The narrative turned. A company that once survived on lineage, now led by principle. There is a specific, intoxicating cadence to seeing structure bend the arc of an industry. It feels grand without being ostentatious, like pulling a thread that unraveled complacency. My mentorship evolved into a program with teeth. I didn't want applause or sentimental testimonials. I wanted people who would carry forward what I had learned about ownership, literal and figurative. Fellows were given real authority, oversight budgets, seats in committees, veto rights, and certain appointments. They learned to read shareholder agreements with the same fluency others read poetry. We taught them how to build voting coalitions, how to draft irrevocable governance agreements, and how to shape narratives so they couldn't be shouted down by legacy noise. The curriculum included negotiation labs, emotional resilience coaching, and legal clinics where they filed things, incorporations, trusts, small but irreversible moves that guaranteed agency. Watching a woman in her late 20s, nervous and blunt, stand up in a room of veterans and say, "I vote no," with a trembling voice that turned into command, that was the kind of theater I loved. It was proof that power could be taught and passed on without turning into the brittle thing my ex-father-in-law had wielded. Globally, the company became a case study. We hosted summits with NGOs, regulators, and peers. We exported models, a governance playbook that other firms adapted, an open-source HR policy template that smaller companies use to avoid predatory practices, a scholarship for women from industries known for turnover and precarity. The work required a different cadence, meetings with ministers, op-eds that I rarely wrote but always edited, quiet dinners with people who could shift policy. These were the grand gestures, treaties signed, initiatives launched, reputations rebuilt over years, yet each lofty meeting had a shared foundation, the same clauses and memos the fellows had learned to draft in our lab. Grandeur without roots collapses. Structure without imagination becomes merely efficient. I aimed for both. There were costs. For every public victory, some part of my personal life cost me ease. Invitations piled up, panels, awards, interviews, each one a little theft of solitude. I accepted many of them not for vanity, but because attention was leverage. Construct the narrative and the structures. Outside the boardroom stood someone I immediately recognized, Ava, one of my earliest fellows. When she had joined the mentorship program years ago, she was all sharp edges and caution, a woman who spoke like every sentence was a test she might fail. Now she stood with her back straight, her composure precise and clean, but her eyes, those betrayed something the posture tried to hide. Anxiety, anticipation, a quiet storm. "You're early," I said. She exhaled in a breath that sounded like she'd been holding it for hours. "I needed a moment before everyone comes in." "That's wise," I replied. Quiet precedes clarity. We walked into the boardroom together. It wasn't the same one I had been humiliated in years ago. This room was larger, more open, absent the heavy portraits, absent the shadows of legacy ego. The new design reflected the company's evolution. Glass panels, adjustable lighting, clean acoustics. A room built to invite conversation rather than intimidate. Ava placed a folder on the table, hesitated, then spoke in a low voice. "They're planning to push me out." I didn't flinch. Power, I knew, always circles back to its old habits if left unchecked. "Who?" I asked. "The operations vice chair, 3 of his allies. They want to install someone with traditional leadership values." She grimaced at the phrase. I nodded, recognizing the pattern instantly. "They underestimate you." "They dismiss me," she corrected, my own words echoing back to me from years before. I felt a quiet rush of pride. "Good. Then you already know the difference." She opened the folder. Inside were printed emails, projections, restructuring proposals, evidence of the quiet sabotage being orchestrated. It was organized meticulously, the way I had taught her. Facts first, emotions later, narratives last. "What do you want to do?" I asked. Her jaw tightened. "Fight." "Good." I paused. "But not the way they expect." She looked at me then, not as a mentor or former executive, but the woman who once walked out of a boardroom carrying a list of shelters and built an empire from the humiliation. "What would you do? Now, not the past you. You." I considered this carefully. The room felt still, the city outside muted by snow. "I would make sure the system corrects them, not you." She frowned. "Meaning?" "Don't outshout them, outstructure them." A slow understanding dawned across her expression. I continued. You have their data. You have the compliance trail. You have their contradictions documented. But that's reactive. What you need is proactive architecture. I tapped her folder. This proves misconduct. But what you should present is a governance amendment that makes their strategy impossible in the future. She inhaled sharply. An amendment to require performance-based review before leadership transition suggestions? And a clause requiring independent audits for any proposed removal of an executive with less than 3 years in tenure. She nodded quickly, connecting the pieces. They can't accuse me of retaliation if the amendment applies to everyone. Exactly. That's not revenge. That's safeguarding the institution. Her shoulders relaxed, but her eyes shone with a mix of resolve and something warmer. Respect, or perhaps recognition of the moment she stood in, the moment I had once stood in myself. Will you sit with me when I propose it? She asked quietly. I smiled. No. Her surprise flickered in her expression. Why not? Because legacy means they fear you, not my shadow. You'll go in alone, but I'll be in the building. A slow, steady confidence filled her posture, like steel cooling into shape. Okay, she whispered. Okay. The board members filtered in, slowly, taking their seats, murmuring greetings, adjusting papers. When Ava stepped forward, the room quieted. She began with composure. No tremble, no hesitation. She presented her amendment with clarity, item by item, building a fortress of logic around herself so thoroughly that even the dissenters found no breach to exploit. When she laid down her final supporting document, the vice chair's contradictory directives, the room shifted. Not dramatically, but undeniably. Eyes sharpened. The silent calculus rearranged itself. When the vote was called, the amendment passed unanimously. And just for a moment, when the papers were signed and the room dissolved into polite chatter, she looked toward the door where I stood unseen. I nodded once, and she understood everything. The cycle had completed, but not repeated. Later that night, as snow fell in slow, mesmerizing spirals, I walked through the quiet building. I paused before the boardroom one last time. It stood empty, warm lights reflecting off the polished table. Ava's voice echoed faintly in my memory. They dismiss me. Not anymore. Legacy wasn't what I built alone. It was what lived without me. And for the first time in years, I felt something deep, steady, almost unfamiliar. Peace.
10 years reshapes a company the way tides reshape a coastline, slowly, then suddenly. The walls of the boardroom had been replaced twice. The institute had grown from a pilot program into an academy with international chapters. Competitors that once dismissed our governance model now cited in their annual reports. I had stepped down from my role as acting CEO 5 years earlier and transitioned into an executive chair position, not out of fatigue, but precision. Leadership must rotate before it rusts. I believe this deeply. And yet, even in my semi-retirement, my signature still appeared on the most sensitive charters, the ones that governed restructuring, ethics, and long-term strategy. Influence, when built correctly, does not vanish, it disperses. On a cold morning in early winter, I arrived at the headquarters earlier than usual. The lobby was quiet, washed in blue dawn light. A young receptionist greeted me with a nervous smile, clearly briefed on who I was, but unsure how to meet my gaze. I returned the smile gently. Authority, when no longer needed for defense, becomes something softer. I made my way upstairs, the elevator climbing with a hum that felt familiar.
A slow, lethal calm settled over her. You planned for this possibility. Of course I did. Systems must survive what people create to destroy them. Later that day, Ava walked into the boardroom, alone, as she insisted, and requested the independent audit. Her voice carried steady authority. If there is misconduct, she said, the company deserves the truth. And if there is none, the company deserves stability. It was a sentence crafted with surgical elegance, calm enough to reassure, bold enough to corner. The vote passed. Within days, the audit team arrived. For 3 weeks, investigators combed through files, reviewed communications, interviewed staff. The entire building felt like a cathedral holding its breath. But Ava never flinched. She kept working, attending meetings, mentoring, signing documents. Her silence wasn't submission, it was strategy. She had learned the difference. When the audit results finally arrived, they were brutal, but not toward Ava. The report concluded, no evidence of misconduct in Ava's division, multiple irregular communications traced back to the vice chair circle, coordinated attempt to destabilize executive leadership, ethical breaches requiring disciplinary action. The boardroom air that morning was electrified. People read the documents with widening eyes. The vice chair turned pale, sweat gathering at his collar. Ava read every page with a calm so sharp it bordered on elegance. The vote passed. Unanimous. The vice chair and 2 allies were removed. When the gavel sounded, a subtle shift passed through the room, like the quiet moment after a storm finally breaks. Ava stood slowly, not victorious, not vindictive, just certain. I watched from the doorway, unseen but present. This time I did not need to walk in to steady the room. The room had already chosen its leader. Later, she found me in the hallway. "It's done," she said softly. It was always going to be. She exhaled a long, heavy breath that seemed to empty years from her lungs. I handled it. Yes, you handled it without becoming what you fought. A faint, rare smile ghosted across her lips. I learned from you. No, you surpassed me. She stood still for a moment, letting the words settle like sunlight on cold stone. Then she straightened, the newly claimed authority resting easily across her shoulders. "What now?" she asked. "Now," I said, "you lead and I watch." And in that moment, I knew. Legacy had stopped being a theory. It had become a lineage of strength, quiet, unshakable, and multiplying. End. What did you think of that twist? Let me know in the comments below. Have you ever faced a betrayal like this? If you enjoyed this story, please hit that like button, subscribe for more stories of justice, and share this video with a friend. Until next time, stay strong.